Today we'll learn about the factors of production. So what essentially are the factors of production? They are the resources that we use to satisfy people's wants. And the way to do that is to produce goods and services, because the goods and services are the things or commodities that people use to satisfy their wants. And these goods and services require specific resources to make, right? For example, we need labor, we need some sort of machineries, we need someone to manage all these things and combine them together and make something out of it, right? So if you just think about a production process, a very simple production process can be to cook something, right? So how do you cook something? How do you produce food? You need land to produce food, which is basically all the natural resources. So all the vegetables that you collect, all the products that you collect, they are your land. And then you have a cook, you have a chef, you have someone who makes the food, and that is the labor. Any sort of human resource that you use in your production process is called labor. And then you have capital. Capital is the stove, the pan, and everything that is man-made that helps you in your production process. And then there is the owner of probably, for example, the restaurant, right? So that owner will be the enterprise, the person who combines all these different factors of production to give you your product to satisfy your want. So essentially, these factors of production, there are 4 factors of production: land, labor, capital, and enterprise. So what is land? Land are all the natural resources that we use for our production. Anything that you find naturally, it doesn't necessarily have to be literal land, even though literal land is an example of land in economics. We say that land are all the natural resources, starting from the trees, the chicken, the fish, and everything that we get in our production process that is natural. And what is labor? Labor is all the human resources that we have to make these products. And it can be physical, it can also be mental, all right? So, for example, it can be a labor working in a construction site, carrying very heavy objects to produce that building or to make that building. It can also be a teacher. So a teacher is also an example of labor. A teacher is someone who produces education, and that is the labor. The teacher is the labor. So any sort of human resource that we use in our production process is called labor. It can be physical, it can be mental. Capital are all man-made assets, and this is important. This is an important distinction between capital and a lot of other factors of production, right? So capital needs to be made by human beings, which means that it has already been produced. So it is essentially another product that you use to make other products. For example, a hammer, right? A hammer is something that was man-made, and that was created by people. It was a product created by people to help them make a lot of different other products, right? So in capital, it can include a lot of machineries, it can include a lot of tools and a lot of things that we use in our production process. And then finally, the most important factor of production is the enterprise. And what does the enterprise do? Enterprise has 2 distinct functions. One of the function is to combine all the factors of productions, right? So what it does is it tells you how much land to take, where to take it from, how much capital to take, where to take it from, and how much labor to take and where to take it from. And then it tells all these factors of production what to do and how to do them. And by doing all that, you are creating a product itself. And when you perform all these tasks, what are you actually doing? You are actually taking a huge risk, right? Because you're not entirely sure if your product will be sold or not, which means that the job of an entrepreneur or enterprise is not only to combine the factors of production, but it is also to take risks and also, in a sense, innovate, be creative, take risks. So these are the applications of an enterprise, the functions of an enterprise. What do you do as an enterprise? Now, it's very important for you to know a lot of different things about these factors of production, so that, because in economics we learn how to use these resources or these factors of production in the most efficient manner. So it's important for you to know how exactly we use these factors of production. So the first thing we learn about factors of production is income, which means if you use these factors of production, what do you earn? What is the income behind the use of these resources? So if you use land, you will earn a rent. If you use labor, you will earn wages. If you use capital, you will earn interests. And the income of an enterprise is very intuitive. If you own a business, if you run a business, if you combine everything, then your reward should be the profit that you get from the business, right? And we need to know two other things, which is the geographical mobility and the occupational mobility. So the geographical mobility and the occupational mobility. And what does that essentially mean? Geographical mobility means how easy it is to transport these factors of production from one place to another. And occupational mobility is how many different forms of production you can do by using these factors of production. Example will make it significantly more clearer. For example, if you can say that a pen, it's very easy to take a pen from your house to your school, right? Which means you can produce education in your house by using that pen, and you can also produce education in your school by using that same pen, which means a pen has a very high geographical mobility because it can be moved very easily. So in terms of land and also capital, the geographical mobility really depends on the resource in and of itself. For example, if you're talking about literal land, you cannot move land from one place to another, right? But you can move chickens, you can move eggs from one place to another very easily. You can transport it in a truck or in any form of vehicle, right? But for instance, if you have a tree which is very large, it is very difficult to transport that from one place to another, right? So you can't really say for sure if land and capital has a high geographical mobility. It really depends on the size of that land or capital, right? So for instance, if it's a very small capital like a pen, it can be moved very easily from one place to another. But if it's a huge machine that requires a very large truck or a very large vehicle to move, then it has a very low geographical mobility. In terms of labor, it really depends as well, but it depends on a lot of things, right? So you as a labor will only choose to go work in a place which is nice, right? Which has a lot of political stability, which probably has a lot of good health care around that place, which has a lot of good schools around that place, right? So for instance, your parents will definitely want to work somewhere where it is easier to provide their children with education, where there are better roads, where there are better hospitals, right? So all these things depend on the geographical mobility. So if a country has a very good living conditions all over the country, then in that country, labor has a very high geographical mobility. But for instance, if in a country there's only one city where there's very good education and very good healthcare, very good opportunities, that place will have a very high geographical mobility, but the rest of the place, the labor has very low geographical mobility. So that also depends on a lot of things. And enterprise is more or less the same. but enterprise depends on other factors. So what does the geographical mobility of enterprise depend on? It depends on how easily you can start a business somewhere. So if it's very easy to start a business anywhere in the country, then in that country your enterprise has very high geographical mobility. But if that country, for instance, has a lot of laws, a lot of regulations for you to build a business, then enterprise will have a very low geographical mobility, because you just cannot simply go anywhere in your country and start a business. It requires a lot of permissions, and you have to go through a lot of logistical things in the way. Occupational mobility essentially means how many different types of products you can produce by using that factors of production. For example, if you're talking about land, what can you produce by using chicken? Nothing apart from probably food, right? You can only eat the chicken. But if you talk about trees, how occupationally mobile are trees? Trees are actually very occupationally mobile, because with trees you can produce furniture, you can produce beds, you can produce paper, you can produce so many things by using trees, right? Which means trees has a high occupational mobility. So land and capital, the occupational mobility actually depends on how many different types of things you can make with it. All right. So if you give an example of capital, think of a computer. A computer actually has a very high occupational mobility, because it can do so many operations by using just one capital, right? But if you think about hammer, what can you do by using a hammer? You can just break things, nothing else, right? So hammer has a very low occupational mobility. In terms of labor, what does the occupational mobility depend on? It actually depends on your skills, right? It depends on your skills. It depends on your education. So if you have a lot of education in a lot of diverse areas, if you know economics, if you know maths, if you know science, if you know business, then you can become whatever you want, right? You can do whatever you want, produce whatever you want. So it really depends on your education and how much skill you have. If you know a lot of programming, then you can become a data analyst. If you know a lot of science, you can become a scientist. If you know a lot about business, you can become a businessman. Which means the more skills and education you have, the more occupational mobility that you will have. You can do a lot more occupation, or you can do a lot of different tasks as well. Similarly goes to enterprise. If you have a lot of skills and if you have a lot of flexibility in your country about different types of businesses, so it also depends on country's regulations, all right, and how supportive your country is of starting a new business. So if your country provides, if the government provides a lot of subsidies to, for example, to new businessmen, if the government provides subsidies to small business owners, then everyone will be willing to become an enterprise, right? Which increases your occupational mobility. And by using ideas about geographical mobility and occupational mobility, you can actually tell how to improve the quality and quantity of these factors of production. It's very simple, right? So think of it like this. If you provide more education to your population, if you give more grants to new entrepreneurs, if you provide more opportunities to people, then their occupational and geographical mobility of labor and enterprise will increase, right? If you don't harm the environment by doing a lot of different pollution, then you are increasing the quality and quantity of your land, the natural resources that you get, right? If you have a lot of technological advances in your economy, it means that you have a lot of better capital in your economy, right? And that's how you improve the quality and quantity of capital. So you always have to think, how do we improve the geographical and occupational mobility of these factors of production? And that is exactly how you can improve the quality and quantity of these factors of production.